start with a quote that I remember coming across probably about 7 years ago now, when I started thinking about what we needed as human beings to navigate through what is best described now as a 100-year life, and credit to Dr. Lynda Gratton for that term, or alternatively a multi-stage life, which is one that breaks away really from the model of my parents' generation, which was three-stage education, work, and retirement, to something that is much more, sort of multi-hyphenate and less linear, and one where longevity, technology plays a much more prevalent role. I was also having a lot of thoughts about changes in my life at that time, which made me sort of veer from excitement and possibility through to complete panic, and there was also these sort of huge identity shifts that were going on. So sometimes, okay, often I feel the urge to drop this quote into some of my conversations, and so I'm going to do it now. There is nothing like returning to a place that remains unchanged to find the ways in which you yourself have changed. Now, that was Nelson Mandela. And I'm saying this as my guest today, by and large, wrote the songs for their second album in 2020, a year in which, instead of being a year in which she built on her success and achievements, turned out to be a period of real sort of extreme turmoil, grief, and disconnection. Fast forward to 2024, and those songs have, after 4 years, appeared on the second album called Ripe Fruit Falls But Not in Your Mouth, which is a wonderfully sort of shape-shifting, almost chameleon-esque storybook. And it's wild to me how the music can veer into a track from, sort of fabulously sparse old school rapping style to a more R&B vocal style, each track really sort of showcasing a vocal versatility. Each song really sort of feels like a journey in itself, almost an urban journey, if that makes sense. So anyway, instead of me pretending to know what I'm talking about, I'm going to welcome Hua Li to the show, and it's a real honor to see you. Thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, I'm so delighted to be here, and thank you for a lovely, insightful intro.
Well, it's I'll say that these sort of things around what I'd be interested in is sort of going into the sort of the multi hyphen life, because I mean really you're kind of living that, with sort of your various roles, let's call them, which I think is really really interesting, and I think that this is happening a lot more now. I feel. I don't know how you feel about that.
Uh, I think it is happening more now, and something I've been thinking a lot about is the idea of what is success
Mm,
in late capitalism,
yes, yeah,
and I was my dear mother is always so concerned about me and wishes I was a lawyer and all of this stuff.
yeah,
But I was saying to her one time, I know you're worried about me because it seems like I'm always working and I work so hard.
mm,
But I feel like the real success I have in my life is that I have an unlimited access to jobs at any
mm,
time, and I never feel like I'm in need. I shouldn't say that. I often feel like I'm in need
yeah.
because of the reality of the music industry, but I always have a means to have a solution in my life,
Mm,
and that's being broad as artist, label manager, live show production, educator, all of these things.
yeah,
It just means that I really have so much opportunity, and that's what I think
yeah,
success looks like to me, at least now.
mm. I mean, that completely makes sense. I think that's a really good point, because if about the, having access to, if you want to call it jobs, work, or opportunities, when you have that mindset, if you think, but I think, about being like in one industry, let's say, or one job, like a lawyer, like an accountant,
Mhm.
or whatever. You're really kind of subject to the kind of the vagaries of that role. that job. It's like, kind of okay, if you, I mean, of course, in the music industry, if you get made redundant or whatever, there are all sorts of risks. But it's almost like when you take one job, you are putting all your job risk into kind of into that area. Whereas what you're doing is there are so many different parts to what you're doing, and if one's
Mhm.
not busy or not working, then there's others that you can do. So it's that sort of multi-skill.
I have a very diversified job portfolio.
Yeah. Which is completely what when I started thinking about all of this, what I came to, with the, when I was thinking about what sort of skills we need. I guess that
Mhm.
I think, thinking about my parents, they were, what you said that your mother wanted you to be a lawyer. I mean, my dad, he came from nothing. He had when he was growing up, he had no money. The family had no money or anything. He got himself an education, qualified as a mechanical engineer. And I think because of that, because he lacked that sort of security, maybe sort of financial security when he was a
Mhm.
kid and growing up. That's what he always told me was the basically kind of like of paramount importance to have that sort of security. It's interesting how your childhood experiences form, what you believe and what you pass on.
For sure, yeah. I mean, I think I'm very lucky in that my parents had very different experiences. My mom grew up during the Cultural Revolution in China.
Yeah. Yeah.
She was sent for re-education when she was, like, a kid, like,
Mm,
sent to farm, and just turmoil, uncertainty, things literally being taken from the family, by
mm,
the Communist Party. Um, my dad, on the other hand, was, like, grew up in the hippie era
mm,
in Canada.
mm.
And, it's not to say that there was no difficulty in his life, but it was a much more hopeful and freewheeling time, and he
Yeah.
experienced a lot of freedom as a young person. So it was interesting growing up in that home where on one hand there was a huge value placed on um, security, uh, keeping things safe, making sure that no one can take anything from you and that you have a very clear path that is guaranteed.
Yeah.
Whereas my dad was like, just idolized rock stars, like really wanted me to go into music,
Yeah.
um, always discouraged me from having like a backup plan. Like he was like,
Really?
no, you're going to be an artist. It's clear to me. Don't get distracted. Don't,
Mm.
they were often at odds with each other because of that as well.
Yeah.
But I do feel really um, quite lucky that those two perspectives were always around in the sense that no, I didn't really have a backup plan, but
Mm.
um, I was very singular about wanting to be in music, first and foremost being a musician, but that I was clear to me that all of these other support roles within the music world um, could be kind of funneled back into that. And
Mm.
so, it's like, yeah, I can't play shows every night. It's just not a reality. So
Yeah.
if I need to pay my bills, maybe I can do some other stuff.
Just some of
And
that.
and that's always been kind of how I've managed those two perspectives.
That I mean, that's really interesting how you've, sort of switched between those. I mean, I have a I as part of this thinking I was doing, it was around that, that the more kind of intangible skills are becoming more and more. I mean, this was the whole reason that I started this podcast, to be honest with you. It was like I was thinking that, things like adaptability, things like curiosity, those more sort of intangible,
Mhm.
or intangible as they've been called in our sort of society, are so much more important these days, and I would say are as important as, some of the more tangible ones, the more kind of technical, like in the West, it's always been, the emphasis has been put on, getting your, kind of maths and
Mhm.
trigonometry and that kind of stuff.
Not
But
maths and trigonometry.
this those words I thought I'd never utter again. Calculus and ugh, ugh, there's the fear of God into me. I hated it. I don't know why I did that. I don't know why I did maths at A level. I was so unsuited to it. But
Me
I think
too.
that this is a something to do. It's to do with what my dad was a he was into his maths and stuff like that. Anyway, that's a separate topic of how I got into that. But yeah, but and it struck me that that musicians, because of their life, it felt to me like they had these sort of intangibles much more than most of them. I mean, you could say that okay, well, artists or dancers, anybody sort of in the arts would is likely to sort of have these, but musicians sort of felt really right for me.
Mhm. I think, there's 2 things that have benefited me greatly in all of the other avenues in my life that come directly from being a musician and a performer. Or I should say 3 things. One of them is discipline.
Mm,
Just the desire to get up, practice, feel, the joy of those small increments of progress.
yes.
Um, that's something that, I was a classical pianist growing up. It was a part of my life from a very, very young age.
Yeah.
And then beyond that, it's the communication and performance skills that have benefited me so greatly in so many different contexts. I think musicians have a hold on the way to communicate and get to the heart of matters and get to the heart of the emotionality of even the most
Mm,
mundane things
mm,
that can be so helpful in so many contexts. And the performance skills, I mean, just being comfortable, public speaking, presenting ideas, those are skills that people in other industries would die for.
absolutely. Absolutely right. Yeah. I was thinking of the sort of parallels of um of your childhood with mine. I mean, and
Mhm.
on the music side, I started playing the cello when I was
Oh, wow.
8 till 16,
Okay.
17 maybe. And for me, it was it was always at that age, it became a thing that I felt forced to do. I never felt like I had ownership of it.
Uh,
You see, my dad it sounds like I'm bad mouthing my dad. I don't mean to at all, but
it's okay to process dad trauma. I'm here
yeah,
for it.
my own personal therapy. This is what I've been needing.
Isn't that why everyone starts a podcast?
I think it is. I think it is. I just like the sound of my own voice, just sort of talking this sort of these random thoughts that come into my head. It's almost like this stream of consciousness, that comes through. But it was, he was classically trained. He was a singer. He was a
Okay.
choral singer.
Mhm.
He sung, kind of he was in the sort of the bass, the baritone section, and
Okay.
he loved it, and he wanted me to be a musician. So anyway, so I started and did the lessons, and then as I got older, and it's always interesting because I was going to ask you as well about this. Um, I I got into my first music love was not
Mhm.
classical or anything like that. It was probably at the other extreme. It was punk. That was what I first got into.
Mhm.
And that eventually that tension between punk rock and classical,
Mhm.
because there was no other way to play the cello than play classical music when I was sort of growing up in it, or at least in my environment anyway.
Uh-huh.
And but then that was almost like the sort of catalyst for me to start rebelling. So I had a very uncomfortable journey with music with playing an instrument in those sort of early years.
Did you pick up the guitar after the cello?
No, I didn't. I didn't pick up any instrument at all. no.
Oh, how heartbreaking.
I know, and I think because of that, because my dad did not understand, and neither my mum or dad understood the sort of music that I liked. There
Mhm,
was like a complete disconnect. But it's
mhm.
interesting. So both my parents died a couple of years ago, and when they were sort of getting ill, a couple of years before that, what did I do? I bought a cello.
Ah,
Yeah, and I felt like I had a bit of unfinished business and started playing again.
that's wonderful.
Yeah. Uh,
You could put a pickup on that cello and get some distortion pedals and
oh my, now you're
voila.
talking. Now you're talking.
No, but I hear what you're saying. I think, I very luckily, and especially as someone who used to teach private music lessons, I
Mm,
understand now how unique this is, but I really loved playing the piano as a young
yeah,
person.
amazing. Yeah.
Um, I j it was just something I was drawn to. There was a piece of me that really wanted to engage with music in any form.
Mm,
And, so I didn't feel for the longest time really that alienated by the classical world. I it I grew up in an incredibly chaotic home, and
mm,
the time with the piano was really a sanctuary for me, where I
mm,
knew, for these hours that I'm practicing,
yeah.
everyone's gonna leave me alone, and it was always joyful. I loved expressing myself. Obviously it's a brutal world, with
Mm,
extremely high expectations and a very
yeah.
narrow lane for success, so that stuff was frustrating, but, um, I never it was rare that I was forced to practice. It was just a part of my day, my routine, and it was something that I did genuinely enjoy.
Mm,
Which, yeah, I now know is unique, and I'm incredibly grateful that I had that inclination, but, when I got to around, that time, 15, 16, um, for one, I had finished the conservatory program, and the next sort of stage after that would have been a diploma level, certification, and I didn't really have it in me to do a 3-year jaunt through that repertoire after
sorry, what?
having
Sorry to interrupt. What was the what's the conservatory
oh
program?
yes, this is a country specific thing. So in Canada we have the Royal Conservatory of Music, which is, I imagine, comes from England, as so much of our culture does.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
it is a structured um program of examinations and certifications, that
right.
guide you through like a classical repertoire
Understood.
from beginning to advanced.
Yes, I
Um,
get it.
and yeah, in the piano side, it essentially goes up to what they call grade 10, which is
Mm,
quite advanced repertoire. And then after that, they have a diploma level program, which is the equivalent of, not a university degree, but a college diploma.
I got you. Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I had finished my grade 10 and had
Mm,
no real desire to continue on at that point.
mm,
And I was developing an interest in all sorts of other stuff. I had always written songs, um, just sat at the piano and improvised and wrote melodies
mm,
and lyrics. I was very involved in musical theater at that time as well.
wow.
Uh, I loved hip hop and R&B music,
Yeah.
and, all of those things kind of coalesced into, why don't I go into the jazz world? Because that felt like sort of the nexus of the influence on all of those things.
Mm,
Um, so that's really when I started taking vocal lessons quite seriously,
yeah.
and started trying to apply jazz language to my understanding of the piano, which,
Mm,
after being classically trained, was incredibly difficult, actually. It took
mm,
me There's a big learning curve in terms of, like, developing freedom and,
yeah.
overcoming the fear of improvisation on a very
Improvisation.
regimented instrument. And then I ended up moving to Montreal for jazz school, so that's what brought me here, actually.
Oh, fascinating. That's fascinating. I mean, the yeah, the exam thing. That's where I got. I got to grade 8, I think,
Mhm,
is the sort of level. Um, that's really interesting on the improvisation and sort of moving from that sort of framework of, I gue if we can call it sort of more rigid sort of classical framework into that sort of
mhm,
freer thinking.
mhm.
That's that must be sort of quite a challenge.
It was a real mind twister at the time, actually,
Yeah,
because it seemed, obvious that I would go to jazz school on the piano.
yeah,
Um, and I was simultaneously, after I finished the conservatory program, taking voice lessons and jazz piano lessons,
mm,
and was just
wow,
struggling so hard to find that freedom in the instrument.
mm,
So I ended up auditioning for voice, just because I felt like that was more tangible at the
yeah,
time, and I always had piano as my secondary instrument during my jazz degree, and
yeah,
now I can do it, but it really wasn't until the end of my jazz education that I started really building that vocabulary um, and shedding that fear of, "Am I gonna play
mm,
something wrong? What does this mean? I don't how do I know where my
yeah,
fingers are supposed to go if I'm not, having something memorized?" Which really actually is very counterintuitive to a lot of the ways that this music was written and performed, at its time,
mm,
Baroque music, you had figured bass. That's essentially like jazz cymbals,
yeah, yeah,
all of that was improvised. Now it's written down and regimented, but it was never intended that way.
mm,
The in sonatas and concertos, there's the what do you call that at the end? Is it the cadenza?
the cadenza,
Now I'm
yeah,
right.
yeah,
It used to be improvised by the soloist.
mm,
So these are things that it used to be a show of virtuosity and understanding of the piece to be able to interpolate and improvise and put your sonic signature onto something.
yeah,
And now these things are codified, and
mm. Wi
everybody plays the same. You
It's like
know.
it's within a framework, and that's the
Mhm,
once you know the rules, it's then harder to break out of those, and to sort of
mhm,
think outside of those. It fascinates me how our minds work when we have have information in there, and then we've almost got to ignore that or sort of put it to one side to learn something else. I mean,
certainly.
I must say with your I mean, your vocal training. I mean, you have a wonderful voice. I have to say,
Oh,
absolutely
thank you.
wonderful voice, and like I said in the intro, like very versatile. I love your sort of rapping style as well. It's really phenomenal. And what what was it? What was it that attracted you to hip hop?
uh this is a great question. I mean, for one, it was just in the cultural ether when I
Mm,
was growing up. Like, there
yeah,
was no more important kind of popular music genre, I think. It was
yeah,
unavoidable in many ways. Um, my origin story, I often describe, in this way, which is that when I was growing up, um, in my home, things were very, very controlled.
mm,
So there wasn't a lot of television
yeah,
access. Um, so much of my time was spent at the piano.
mm,
Um, all of the CDs in the home were mostly classical music CDs,
yeah.
except for my dad's interest in rock. So,
In rock, yeah,
there
yeah,
was like Steely Dan and Dire Straits and
mm,
Supertramp, Elton John floating around.
yeah,
But mostly, like the CDs I were given were like Chopin, WC.
yes.
Like, listen to some more of this because you seem pretty good at it. Um, so it wasn't until I started, like, being in a space where, kind of in late elementary and early middle school, that I would go to friends' houses and we would
Mm,
listen to some other stuff, and I remember the very first time I had a friend who had The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill,
mm,
and we listened to that together while we were, probably playing dolls or something, who knows?
yeah, yeah,
Um, and I thought it was a kid's record, because that record starts with children's voices, and
Mm,
she's having this conversation with kids about their experiences, and,
yeah,
the children's voices are throughout the record.
yeah.
So to me, it was like, "Oh, this is music for me," but it feels very, complex and
Mm,
intelligent. It's not like a nursery rhyme, like, this is music for me that is substantial.
yeah.
And I did have probably, I would, not to toot my own horn, but probably quite sophisticated listening skills
Sure.
by that
Yeah,
point,
yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Um, so that immediately drew me in, and I was like,
Mm,
"Okay, I need to know more about what this is." Um, and yeah, so sort of through the miseducation of Lauryn Hill, I started kind of discovering other stuff, and then eventually I became more of a latchkey kid. So I would put on, um, our equivalent in Canada to MTV is Much Music. So I would put
mm,
on the rap program late at night when
yeah,
my parents were out of the house, and
yeah.
um, just start absorbing that stuff. And I was like, okay, Busta Rhymes, what is this? And oh, Raw Digga, she's a woman, and like just really starting to absorb that stuff, and I
Mm,
was drawn to it basically because of that one record. I was like, I
yeah.
want to, what is this? I want to learn more. I think also, I'm from a city called Victoria, which is now much more diverse, but when I was growing up, and especially the neighborhoods that we were living in, um, was extremely white dominant.
Yeah.
So there was something about, as I was like the only Asian person, much less person of color in most of my classes
Mm,
in school for the longest
mm,
time. There was something about the Black experience as it was expressed, especially in hip hop at that time, that
mm,
really spoke to me as, like, a marginalized person. Like, I was like, "Oh,
yeah,
okay, this is the reflection of some of the feelings I'm having that I don't know how to articulate yet."
yeah. It's interesting that I was going to ask you about that actually, about the, almost the aside from the music, but the lyrics themselves that kinda drew you in.
Mhm,
I mean, I had the same sort of experience with the with kind of punk music that it felt I've tried to sort of trace this back, and I think that, again, this was part of me sort of rebelling. And to me at that time, sort of punk sort of felt really, kind of like the obvious sort of rebellious. Try and remember, we're talking, kind of what 1980, 81, things like that.
mhm,
So after just
mhm,
after, but I was a little bit late to it, a bit too young for the sort of first wave. Um, but then I was, I would always talk politics with my dad and sort of social issues. And we were very much on the same page, and he really sort of shaped me. And almost that then made me look into. I remember, another sort of game changing album for me was Public Enemy's first album.
yes.
Again, just just the oral sound, the real,
Mhm,
really, sort of aggressive sound that they could sort of produce along with the lyrics. It was just incredibly powerful. I was always drawn to that. And I still am, really drawn to sort of music where it has a message, especially these days
mhm,
as well. Whether it's outwardly political, or just sort of or if it's social commentary, whatever. It's music that's saying something that really talks to you,
mhm.
that's appealing.
There's something about the spoken human voice over music that is
Mm.
incredibly powerful as well. It's a different feeling than singing.
True.
Um,
Yeah.
and I don't know, I can't speculate as to what that is, but I've always found that to be especially moving.
Mm,
And even when you look at someone like Gil Scott-Heron, where it's
mm.
like poetry over music,
Yes.
basically,
Yeah, yeah,
something so emotionally reverent about
yeah.
how that sounds and feels when you're listening to it. And I think I was very drawn to that as well.
With when you mentioned about going around to a friend's house to listen to, and hearing Lauren Hill. I mean, what was your kind of gang? What sort of people did you sort of gravitate towards when you were younger?
I mean, it was that's a very interesting question. I I I was very alone
Yeah.
as a young
Yeah.
person, actually. Um, because my parents were very strict and controlled,
Mm, mm,
um, it was rare. I had certain friends at school, but they were really um, very much schoolmate friends. Like I would see
mm.
them there, and on occasion I would get to go spend an afternoon at their home or something.
Yeah, yeah.
But no, I had a very incredibly solitary childhood in many ways, and I'm
Mm.
also an only child. So
Same here, I
that's
am
what I
too.
mean. Yeah, it's like the
Mm,
time at the piano really was like, oh, this is my playtime. And
yeah,
I was used to not having stimulation from other spaces. I think that's the other thing that made practicing coherent to me, where it was like, okay, well, like either I'm silently drawing a picture or I'm silently trying to play a game with my toys by myself
yeah.
or reading a book. Like it was like, okay, this is something that's engaging and it's something I can do on my own.
Mm,
Um, so I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't I would say it wasn't until later, and as I said, I eventually became kind of a latchkey kid.
mm,
Um, but in more in my teens, I had a friend group and it was, you know, all of the musicians, anyone who played in a band. Um, I I love language. I love books and reading as well. So there were some young writers in our friend group
yeah.
and it was very arts forward, my
Like a
friend.
creative sort of communities were
Yeah.
the
Yeah,
ones that you were
certainly.
sort of attracted to, yeah. I mean,
Certainly.
it's interesting. I mean, do you think that being an only child has been in any way sort of detrimental to you, or has it been over, kind of wholly positive
I
in the kind of the long run?
I yeah, I love this question. My father was also an only child,
Mm,
and he would always, one of his refrains was like, "We don't know how dangerous the world is," and he really tried to impress upon me as a young person that there are certain relationship dynamics and ways of being that we just don't understand because
mm,
we don't have siblings to test those waters with.
mm,
So that was something I was somewhat conscious of. Once I moved out on my own when I was 17.
mm,
Um, so there was that thing, but I was also quite fearless and really hungry for connection and hungry for community and certainly there were some hard lessons along the way, but I think because I'm very extroverted and pretty thick skinned,
mm,
it didn't impact me the same way that I think it impacted my father, just
mm,
based on kind of the warnings that he would give me.
yeah,
I felt I felt at ease socially. And I think he's right in that there are certain ways that siblings like manipulate each other or dynamics that you eventually learn how that you apply that to your adult relationships. Maybe I had to learn those things later on, but it never felt, I don't know, I just never felt disadvantaged,
mm,
and, you know, sometimes I think about, like, "Oh, I really had a lonely childhood," or, I didn't there wasn't a lot of play in my house. I
mm.
had a very serious household, you know?
Interesting,
Um,
yeah.
I didn't have parents that were like, "Let's imagination," you know? So, um yeah, so, I was very precocious. I read a lot as a kid. I had these passions that were always relatively creative. And I don't know, I guess, like, maybe it would have been fun to have more fun as a child, but
Yeah.
I'm happy that I honed all of these skills, and now I have an incredibly fun adult life where I'm
Well,
doing these things I love, and so
absolutely.
I don't know, does it matter that that didn't happen then? I have the most joyful life now, and
Yeah.
a lot of adults around me don't experience this much joy.
It's interesting sometimes, isn't it? When you think about that, that almost what you said there is life sort of turned on its head. It's okay. Well, the childhood was this, but that's an incredibly it's I just think about these sort of societal norms that, when you're a
Mhm.
kid, you're supposed to have fun and blah, 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 and then it begs the question, what actually is fun? But then, that, like you say, so many people, in that old sort of model, you get into working
Mhm.
life, and then I mean, nowadays, you literally look for somebody born today, you're probably looking at, a working life, 50 years.
Right,
I mean, that's insane. That is
right.
insane. That's just not sustainable on that old way of doing things.
Certainly, and I think this is the thing for me. I think children should explore and have fun and have a happy childhood. Don't
Mm,
get me wrong. But um there is so much more psychic weight and emotionality as we enter adulthood and struggle with our identities and who are we
yeah.
and relationships and all of this stuff like why is it that at that point when things are so much more meaningful and memorable in many ways we have to suffer,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so I wouldn't say I had an unhappy childhood. Things
Mm,
were tumultuous, certainly in my home,
yeah.
but the structure was really helpful actually
Yeah.
in that environment, and um, it caused me to mature very quickly.
Mm.
Um, but at the same time, like I wasn't sad all the
No, no,
time,
no, sure, yeah.
that and that was fine. And I think in retrospect, what's nice about that is as a kid, you don't really know what you're missing.
Yeah, yeah,
I
true.
wasn't conscious of like, "Oh, well, Sally gets to go to the park." Like, I was like, "No,
Yeah.
I'm happy playing the piano." Like, there's no
Yeah.
and so the great benefit of that is that I honed all of these skills at a young age that now I get to really enjoy. And
Yeah.
now I'm at a stage in my life where like I have the capacity to have so much gratitude and
Mm,
it's more meaningful in a way.
yeah.
So that's what I mean. It's not to denigrate like certainly kids should have fun and have joy
Yes,
and stuff, but
absolutely. Yeah.
um I feel like it's so much more meaningful and enjoyable now.
Yeah.
And I also get to contrast my life with, my friends that are nurses that have to work so hard and get worn
Yeah.
down and they don't necessarily I play
Yeah.
all the
That
time. I'm a musician. That's what I do. I play music.
totally. Absolutely right. Yeah, again, I mean, I was as a kid, I was always very shy. I'm an introvert.
Mm,
If we're gonna talk about those. And I've learned to adapt and, but there are still times now when I'd be in a situation I think, "Well, do you know what? I'd rather not be here." That kind of but I
uh-huh,
think I had a similar sort of thing. I spent time I had my friends around me, but which changed as I went into the sort of the teenage years.
mhm,
Because I went to a different school to others around me, who I'd grown up with for the that sort of first part of my life, and I got another group of friends. I mean, I still had those, but I didn't see them as much.
uh-huh,
And so I spent more time on my own in my teenage years, probably. And I think now looking back, I think I certainly got more comfortable with myself, and with being with my own thoughts, which is kind of useful for for whatever stage of your life when you have to, as you undoubtedly do, have to spend periods of time on your own. So I've always
definitely.
been sort of comfortable with that, and I'm when I spend time on my own now, I'm kind of quite happy with that.
Me
That's okay.
too.
It's
Yeah.
it's totally fine.
Even as an extrovert, I appreciate those
You
times of
appreciate that,
solitude.
yeah, yeah,
And I think that's so valid what you say. I mean, um, I always journaled and wrote stuff down as a kid,
mm,
and as an adult, it's it's amazing that I have that muscle. There's
yeah,
times I
yeah,
fall off, but when I am taking that time to be reflective and write thoughts down and kind of
mm,
um, you know, do the data dumping that is so
yeah,
helpful for processing in our brains, like, uh, I feel so much gratitude that that's something that feels familiar
yeah,
for me. I think we are in such a hyper stimulating, dopamine driven, adrenaline driven kind of
Yeah.
world that ha- finding comfort in solitude
Mm,
and reflection is so necessary to survive
mm,
all of this stuff.
yeah. You touched on something there about, sort of journaling when you were a kid, and I wonder what it would be like for you if you were to look at those journals now, but think but so that's one thing, but then thinking about, your music. So your new record was
Mhm,
wri was written predominantly, I think, in 2020.
mhm.
So there's that side of it. When you came to bring that into the world, looking back at those songs that you wrote then, which was, um, you know, uh, that sort of period of time became very, very difficult. And then
Uh-huh,
there's also thinking about your first record, when you look back at that now,
uh-huh.
go back to that Mandela quote about how you've changed when you look at a document of something in the past. I'm 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 always really interested in how we view things a few years down the line.
I think that quote is so apt to describe my feelings toward, this new record,
Mm,
in the sense that, the change I underwent in those 4 years is phenomenal.
mm,
Um, at essence, I'm still the same me, but my reactions, the way I see things, the way I navigate relationships is just completely different. And I'm much happier and calmer, and people who have known me for a long time can see that in me.
mm,
That being said, I think this record was such a fraught process for
yeah,
me because it took so long.
mm,
Um, and there were a lot of roadblocks along the way. Um, and part of being in that period of transformation meant that there were very many times along the way that I felt incredibly disconnected from those songs that I had written in 2020.
mm,
Um, you know, there were so many times I went to continue working on that stuff and I was like, I don't believe in this. I don't believe in this person that's talking.
yeah, yeah,
I don't feel connected to it. How am I gonna go on stage and perform this music every night and
yeah,
embody it? What is that gonna feel like? Um, I went and rewrote a lot of the lyrics, which is not something I tend to do,
mm,
actually. So, that helped a lot. But what I think is incredible is that despite, how fraught that was, by the time we got to the finished record, I loved those songs in a way that I have never loved
wow,
music that I've
wow,
created before. And it it is that feeling of, a lot of the ideas and content are a marker of the progress I've made. At the same time, there's that seed that was planted in 2020, and those songs changed and grew with me
mm,
as well.
mm,
So it's this beautiful kind of dichotomy of like, yes, there is a reflection of like time passing and that
yeah,
journey to get there. But there's also the sense of like, oh, how beautiful that there's a plasticity in this art form and that these songs, while they are a marker of time, have also grown with me, and it feels so honest. I mean, I just came off of tour, and there was never any tension around like, oh, I don't want to embody this mood or this
yeah,
statement. Like it felt very authentic and honest every night on stage. So that was a really magical and spiritual kind of process for me as well.
mm,
And I think that's why, it's funny because the title of the record um was like very non-intentional. I just
mm,
picked any random Chinese proverb for the
mm,
first demo to send to
mm,
the label and be like, yeah, this is something.
mm,
But over time, that title has resonated with me more and more. This idea of like, yes, like you do plant a seed and then the tree
yeah,
grows and the apple falls, but there's all of this work involved to receive
to
that fruit,
receive, yeah,
you know?
yeah. If it's not too personal a question, but what's been the biggest change for you or the biggest change that you've gone through, that you really sort of feel has been the biggest change,
Yeah,
if that makes sense?
um, I lost my father in 2020.
Mm.
He died from lung cancer. So that was also, a non-COVID related death during the time of COVID.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so that gave me a lot of perspective, and I think just before that, I had a really intense falling out with, someone who I considered to be my closest friend. Um, right before my father passed away, it was really the last his lung cancer metastasized to his brain, so the last couple months of his life, he wasn't able to communicate anymore. So the last real conversation we had, we were talking about, w what can I do? I'm bereaved about this friendship, I'm confused, what are the tools? And, I can say this now because my father's passed on, but I grew up in a 12-step home. He was a member of AA,
Mm.
and, his sobriety was incredibly important to him, and those were the people that were around. Those were his friends, that was the
Yeah,
community we were a part of.
yeah,
So he suggested that I try going to Al-Anon, which is for friends and family members of alcoholics.
yeah.
Um, and yeah, I think just the process of losing that friendship, starting a 12-step program, losing my father, but then still having this, uh, kind of familial connection with him
Mm.
through the 12-step program, those things coalesced into a period of healing and self-understanding,
Yeah.
that I had just never experienced before. And I
Mm.
think it was those challenges coupled with having the framework and having a support network, especially during COVID, where we were all so isolated,
Yeah.
that really accelerated that growth for me.
Mm.
Um, those things I think couldn't have happened without each other. I needed
Yeah.
those huge disappointments as well as a hugely supportive community to help push
Mm.
me through.
Interesting. I had, in beginning of 2019, um, my mum my mum and dad, were sort of married for s 65 years.
Mhm,
Always lived in the same house, the house that, I grew up in.
mhm,
And, my dad had a brother and a sister. Mum had a brother, and, my mum in 2019 sort of had a fall at home, and she developed Alzheimer's,
okay,
and my dad was sort of looking after her really. But then when she had this fall, when the paramedics came, it was really sort of obvious to them what was sort of going on,
mhm,
and through that, and my mum died. Well, both mum and dad died in 2022. But I remember when my mum had this fall, and my uncle, my dad's brother, lived at the bottom of the road, and they'd sort of become estranged over a period of probably 10 years. And
wow,
he was somebody that always came around. He was an incredible man, and he was a socialist. I learned a lot from him when I was a kid, and I lost touch
mhm,
with him as well.
mhm,
And when I was at home, and when he, as the nearest sort of family, I'm in London, and my parents were up in the north of England. He was the
uh-huh,
closest family member, but he didn't
uh-huh,
arrive until after I'd arrived, and it was the first time I'd seen him for a long, long time. And when he walked through I actually felt him before he'd even walked through the door.
mm,
He was that sort of presence, that sort of gravitas. And
mhm,
and the thing that uh, what I'm getting to is the one of the big changes that I realized about myself was how easily I had lost, or I'd let go of, friendships and sort of family relationships. And I
Mhm,
started to
mhm.
then think about why that was. Why had I done that? And I could pinpoint, sort of certain things. So I guess that, those events, so as horrible as it was, do lead to other things that you look inward
Certainly,
to
yeah.
yourself.
Loss teaches us about ourselves, um, because it's painful, because we don't wanna feel loss,
Mm,
because loss triggers a sense of, wanting to gather resources
yeah.
and,
Mm,
I and it triggers gratitude in so many
yeah.
ways. So, yeah, I think anytime you lose a parent, it changes everything about what you think about yourself,
Yeah.
and it really rocks the boat in terms of how you perceive your identity, who you are in the world, your
Mm,
role in the family dynamic, all of that stuff instantly changes.
mm,
Um, so it's a really fruitful time actually to have that kind of self-reflection
yeah.
and remember what is meaningful. What are the
Mm,
things that are truly important? Um, what are the things that you want to have around you before your next loss or before
absolutely.
you, confront your own mortality and things like that? So, yeah, I mean, it's that challenging time was a blessing for me because I recognized that I wasn't equipped anymore to
Mm,
continue on the way I had been. And I
mm,
was fine. I wasn't terribly distressed, but there were some core wounds there that I needed to work on.
mm,
Um, and now I find myself in a place where I'm much happier and relationally I'm much smarter about um who I am in relationships, what I can give to the people around me, and how much I value the people around me.
and also you're a multi-hyphenate now fighting against late stage capitalism.
Yes.
Absolutely, absolutely. Which is a phenomenal thing, and I think if anything sort of comes, I think that of just the shit show of this world is that it's becoming so laid bare.
Mhm.
Everything that's kind of wrong with capitalism, with colonialism, things have to change. It feels like there's pressure
Yes.
building.
Yes. Or utter destruction of
Or
of
destruction,
civilization,
yes, I mean, that's the
I
that's
mean,
the
I
other.
and I
Yeah.
think that's something that is interesting and completely relates to what we're saying, right? It's in these times of great distress that,
Mm,
ultimately, I think humans are quite lazy.
mm,
So it is we do need, these times of great distress to be the impetus to change. And unfortunately, I mean, uh, like things like Extinction Rebellion and the punk scene have existed
yeah,
forever. Like
yeah,
people have been sounding the alarm on climate change for such a long time.
such a long time. Yeah,
And we are so reticent to change. But now things are coming to a fever pitch of like, wow, things are really falling apart.
yeah.
The entire country of Canada was on fire last year, like
Yes,
that's a
yeah,
huge
yes.
landmass. Like there are these real existential and physically uh, threatening things
Mm,
happening with the climate and the environment, with um, being able to survive in late stage capitalism, with
mm,
real conflict happening in places like Palestine and Congo and Sudan.
yeah,
There's this connectivity and awareness that feels very hopeless at times, and
yeah,
yet I do think that this level of um, globalized distress must be an impetus to change.
yeah,
Otherwise, we will just lie down and things will fall apart, but I don't see humanity doing that.
yeah. I mean, I don't think there's ever been a more important time for individual actions
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
be to be undertaken. That idea of like, oh well, if I don't do it, it doesn't really matter. It's not going to count.
Mm.
Those individual actions really do count to sort of build that sort of snowball, that momentum.
Yes.
for change. I was just reading, the other day about a sort of protest in one of the Dublin colleges, I think
Mhm.
Trinity College,
Uh-huh.
and student action that was listened to. The college took action after
Mhm.
student protests. I think it's finding where the pain point is
Absolutely.
and doing that, and of course it's very, in some parts of the world, it's very, very difficult to take that action because the regimes are very repressive, and
Mhm.
unfortunately that's becoming more common everywhere where those sort of repression tactics are being used. But
Yes.
still, whether it's subversive, however, those sort of things, like the Pussy Riot movement,
Uh-huh.
incredibly important for you know for doing things and getting up and taking action.
Yes. Yes. And I think, Pussy Riot is a great example because they're so brave
Yeah,
and they're so extreme and they're so resilient in terms of the way that they are able to face the consequences and
yeah,
continue on. That does not have to be the gold standard for every individual. We
yeah,
need people like this that are at at the extreme, that are
yeah,
inspirational, that shed light on these issues, but the individual action does not have to go there. I think, some people look at that and they're like, "Wow, like, well, I could never do that." You don't have to be the person that tears the head off the statue, but
yeah,
if you're, like, taking a photo or being present for an action like that,
yeah,
um, if you are, um if you are just someone in a barrier between protesters and the police,
yeah,
whatever, like that is meaningful and it doesn't have to
absolutely.
be like life threatening or extremely consequential. I think everyone needs to find the best way for them to participate in a way that is real and authentic to themselves. Um whether that and I think people need to use their talents as well,
Yeah,
I talk to a lot of musicians about this where they're like, "Oh, what like, how do I help? Like, I
what
don't
can I
know.
do? Yeah,
I'm not an organizer. I'm not an activist." And it's like, okay, but you have this platform and people care about what you're
yeah,
saying. So,
absolutely.
that's part of it.
It
And
is.
part of that is also maintaining your music. Otherwise, you lose your platform.
Absolutely.
It's not about like, okay, well, fuck all of this. I'm gonna, you
Yeah,
know, like all I'm gonna do is activism now. Like, no, that's not what you're good at. Keep
yeah,
doing what you're good at and use that as a means to make the change that you wanna see.
absolutely. Peggy, thank you so much. It's been brilliant. That's a
Thank
really,
you.
really positive note to end on.
Thank you. This has been very, very lovely, and I'm delighted that you invited me on.
Oh, not at all. No, pleasure. No, all pleasure's all mine. Thanks for coming on so much.